Good afternoon. We should begin. So I'd like to introduce Linda Shih, and Linda Shih came to Cornell a couple years ago. She's a professor, assistant professor in Cornell's Department of City and Regional Planning, and her research focuses on urban and regional environmental governance and advancing planning policies to manage urban climate transition in ways that improve social equity. She's an environmental planner by training. Linda, she has worked for ACOM, the Institute of International Urban Development, the Rocky Mountain Institute, and consulted for the World Bank and the American Institute of Architects on projects and research worldwide. She has a PhD in planning from MIT, a master's in planning from Harvard, and a BA and master's in environmental management from Yale. So, welcome.
Is this working? You can hear me? All right. So I always teach during this time for the 2 years I've been here, so I've never attended one of these. So when Peter invited me to give a seminar, I thought we were going to be sitting around the table today. And I'm actually playing hooky from my class to be here, but it's a real privilege to be here and a pleasure to see so many people interested in climate change that you're all taking this seminar together. So how many of you here are freshmen? Okay, sophomores? Sophomores, juniors, seniors, and some of you are past college, I'm assuming. Okay. And how many of you know or have taken classes in city and regional planning? Okay, a few. Maybe after this talk, more of you will want to take some classes with us, maybe fewer of you. But all of you live in cities, or have lived in cities, or will live in cities. So a lot of the things that I'm talking about today, I think will be familiar to you in an intrinsic level. And I also am not getting into too much about climate change and the reality and the science, because I'm assuming you've gotten a lot of that to date. So what I'm focusing my talk today is on what do we do about the spatial mismatch of where we live and where we ought to live, given that our cities already are where they are. And what are the policies that guide and shape where we choose to live and where we choose to develop, and what that means for our adaptation moving forward. So, here, is this better? Okay, this seems somewhat more distant, but okay, I will be proper. So here's a picture on the screen of Long Island City, which is where Amazon's HQ2 is going to be. And it was fairly well known from New York City's own vulnerability assessments that this site was going to be inundated chronically, permanently, within a few decades. And yet here we were about to sink several $1 billion worth of investment and all the associated jobs and infrastructure that was going to go into this site. And as we go on, we'll see more about where New York's going with this, right? So we know something about the risks of waterfront, but that has not at all changed what our plans are to date about what to do on the waterfront. And yet when we see then, after the aftermath of an event, do people know where this is? Okay, where is this? Maybe a student, where is this? No? New Orleans. So this is New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Some of you now, I think, are young enough to maybe not remember this from the news. This is also Katrina, or New Orleans. After events like this, we suddenly have this debate. Why do we keep building in these places? Should we go back to investing in these places? Should we move people back into these places? Why don't we manage our land use better? How about this picture? Where is this from? Miami? No. New York? No. You got to use your urban Sherlock Holmes here. Wide roads, circular development, large single family houses. Houston. Okay. This is Houston after Hurricane Harvey. How about this? California. This is Malibu. So after events like this, you'll hear a lot about Houston and how it was their poor land use planning and the fact that they've paved over all their wetlands. And if only they had better land use planning, this kind of thing might be avoided. Right? So poor land use planning becomes part of that picture. Why don't we change things and where we are? And the fires, and as you see from this, it's not clear whether this is affecting mostly poor people, mostly rich people. And Katrina, the implications were certainly for marginalized, underinvested in communities, disinvested communities, poor communities. You'll see from this kind of thing, right? These are very wealthy homeowners and wealthy communities, and certainly the wildfires have touched perhaps disproportionately more wealthy homes than poorer homes. And so then there's, of course, different responses. In New Orleans, you'll see that there was a whole effort after Hurricane Katrina to say we shouldn't be investing. Let's not rebuild. Let's take this opportunity when nature has done the work of that would be difficult politically, and just clear out those really low-lying places. This is the infamous Green Dot Plan. And so people were looking at this, having fled New Orleans from shelters in Houston and family and other places, and seeing this in the Times-Picayune on the front page and thinking, is that a green dot on my house? And then the New York conversation, similar devastation, well, maybe not similar, but equally widespread devastation in terms of power outages, flooding, an inability to move back. People have not been talking about moving out of New York, right? No one suggested that we should be retreating from the waterfront. And in fact, you'll see there's renewed, even yesterday or 2 days ago, Mayor de Blasio came out with a $5 billion plan to protect New York City. So there are these conversations, but what I want to do with today's framework piece is to show that we have never, as a nation, decided that we should not be building in places that are vulnerable. And in fact, the entire policy framework of the country with respect to land use management, disaster aid, insurance, and infrastructure has been precisely to incentivize maximizing land use and development for any municipal government, for any municipal mayor that wants to be re-elected. So I'm going to go through this kind of equation, and then I want to show how this works out in a local place that I've been studying in Metro Boston, Coastal Boston, and then I want to open it up for conversation with you. Okay, so here's the national, state, local policy framework, and this is quite well known from people who have studied disaster management in this country for a long time. Early on, we had a lot of floods. We had the devastating Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, and you see above in this photo the kind of Katrina-esque photo of people standing on their rooftops. And it flooded tens of thousands of square kilometers, astronomical damages. And so the government, the federal government said, we don't want to have this continue. We're going to build levees up and down. And you can see that there's about 2,000 miles of levees along the Mississippi River, leading ultimately to New Orleans. And you can see that these levees, we're not talking about a seawall. A levee can be more than 100 feet wide at the base, 8 feet wide at the top, 15 to 30 feet tall. So these are massive infrastructure systems to protect communities from flooding up to a certain level of risk, right? You can go up to a 1% chance of risk that year. You can go up to a 1,000-year risk. You can go up to 10,000-year risk. So in the Netherlands, they do up to like a 1 in 10,000-year risk, right? But the higher you go, the more infrastructure you have to build, the costlier it is, and the rarer, the less frequent the event is. So the cost-benefit ratios begin to change. So in this country, we mostly have invested in infrastructure up to the 1 in 100 or 1 in 500 level of flooding. But eventually, this kind of levee has to be maintained. There's 2,000 miles of it, right? This is like a Great Wall equivalent worth of levee infrastructure. It will fail. It needs to be maintained, or it can be overtopped. It can be weakened in different points. And what happened in Hurricane Katrina was that these levees were ultimately weakened and failed, which is what led to the catastrophic flooding in New Orleans. And New Orleans, much of it is more than 8 feet below sea level. 8 feet below sea level. And this in blue, you can see the massive amount of flooding. in places that were vulnerable. And those tended to be newer developed sites. The original settlements, the initial settlements in New Orleans tended to be on the highest ground. But as we see in communities, coastal communities across the country and elsewhere, as newer people come, they have less memory, historical knowledge about a place, and there's more demand for land, less infrastructure to go elsewhere, and so people build more and more in vulnerable places. And after Katrina, you know, the Green Dot Plan received such a backlash that it was politically scrapped. And we went back to investing in major infrastructure that would protect communities and enable them to go back. So there's a huge amount of, I'm forgetting how many billions of dollars sunk into this pumping station outside of New Orleans, which is the country's largest, to keep that water system working in New Orleans. That kind of infrastructure, we'll see in a few slides later on, continues to be a dominant form by which we talk about resilience planning today. And sometimes now, more and more, it's in the shape of green infrastructure rather than gray infrastructure, but the effect is kind of the same. And I think that there are lots of benefits of green infrastructure, which are things like sand dunes and bioswales and trees and wetlands and different kinds of living levees that mimic the forces of nature to provide multiple benefits: stormwater retention, biodiversity, stormwater cleaning, flood mitigation. But it's important to note that these things require a lot of land. So it's not necessarily that they can be easily inputted into existing densely settled places, and that they also have to be maintained. And as we've seen from the constructed wetlands, which is after the Clean Water Act, the Army Corps and the government said you can't fill any more wetlands, right? You can only fill wetlands if you contribute to a mitigation bank that's going to build replacement wetlands. And what we've seen with the replacement constructed wetlands is that they don't provide nearly the same amount of ecological benefit that the wetland that got paved over provided. So these systems provide human benefit, but it's unclear at what scale of ecological benefit these kinds of systems provide. So all of these forms of infrastructure investment, a massive federal scale, have enabled us to have this semblance of safety and security while living in places that are known to be hazardous. They have made it safer for us to invest permanent fixed assets into those kinds of places. And the more that you build that infrastructure in a levee effect, the more you invite other people to come and live there. Whereas previously it might have been inundated every so often, now there's a giant seawall or a berm there, and people think, okay, now it's safe, so we're gonna move there. And so lots of people begin to move into risky areas because that infrastructure gets built. Now, if you wanna understand the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, you can go watch Don Oliver give a really nice explanation of this. Probably the best explanation that I've seen. So the NFIP, right? So now we have this physical infrastructure system. The NFIP was started by the federal government when it began FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It began FEMA, and it also established its National Flood Insurance Program because it was seen that the infrastructure doesn't completely alleviate the risks. People still have flooding from coastal storms or inland flooding, and so there needed to be a mechanism to help people rebuild after they have lost their homes or it was damaged in a flood. So the NFIP becomes a way for people to pay into insurance. Now, the risks are very well known for flooding. And if you see here, the number of repetitively flooded properties are many, and they are what I think less than 1%, 1.3% of all policies taken out, but they account for 25% of all claims of NFIP. So flood insurance is something that the private insurance industry has been very reluctant to get into because unlike many other forms of insurance, it's just not profitable. The damages are significant and extreme. And so until very recently, the flood insurance has only been provided in this country by the public government, right? So NFIP. Now, if you look at how, and then in addition to flood insurance, which can help you rebuild, and recently there was a study that just came out about how unequal this policy is in terms of the repayments substantially benefit people who have homes, who are wealthy enough to buy homes, and the wealthier you are, the more you can get out of NFIP. So it's a very unequal program. But then there's also disaster aid. So after you've been hit by a disaster, the whole purpose of a government, why we have any kind of pooled savings and monies, is to help each other in time of crisis. So disaster aid, as you can see from what FEMA has doled out since 2005, mitigation is a very small part of their funding. And $36.5 billion has been given more for post-disaster aid. And moreover, this is post-disaster recovery. It doesn't necessarily require you to build your house any differently from what you did before, hence why you have so many repetitively flooded properties. Now, what we've seen over time is that you can see the rise. I'm sorry, the font is so small, but on the bottom, the horizontal axis is showing presidencies since President Eisenhower ending with President Obama. And the bars show the number of disasters and emergency declarations. So you can see that over time, there has been significantly increase in the number of disaster declarations. And just in 2018, we had untold numbers of major billion-dollar disasters around the country. And so the average number of billion-dollar damages has gone up, and the average number of that has gone up by year. And so when you have, on the one hand, a government that is advocating austerity, budget cuts of all kinds, and then you get this series of disasters, you haven't budgeted, right? So FEMA normally, in blue, what you see every year, the FEMA small amount of money to help with regular maintained disasters, mitigation, and all that kind of assistance. But when there's a big disaster, they don't just have, what was it, $50 billion lying around for Hurricane Katrina and Wilma. This is ending 2010. They don't have that extra money lying around. So where does that come from? If you're a government, where you suddenly need, I don't know, $50 billion. Where are you going to get it from? The military. One wishes the military. Okay. Delete one nuclear bomb, insert post-disaster recovery. It doesn't quite work that way. Where else would you get it from? Yes?
Either you're going to go into more debt or you're going to raise taxes.
Okay. How popular is raising taxes?
Not popular?
Not popular. Okay. So here is for Hurricane Harvey. And you can see that they took on about $5.5 billion of debt for Hurricane Harvey. And in fact, for 2018, with all those billion-dollar disasters that I showed you, we went into 18% of the debt that we took out that year came from disaster assistance. So the more that we have this land use problem, where people are living where there are areas prone to disasters, fires, flooding, all those kinds of things, the more we're going to have to shell out in terms of recovery, and the more debt, it seems, that we're willing to go into. Okay. So you can see that $15 billion, another $36 billion for Puerto Rico. And so all of that was $140 billion in a 6-year hurricane period in 2018. So then you think, maybe we should be, if we're doling out all this federal money, we should have some stipulations on municipalities, right? So states do require localities plan. This is an old map, but most states actually don't even require local governments to come up with any kind of land use plan. Not all the coastal states even require municipalities to have a land use plan. And if you do have to have a land use plan, most of them don't say anything about hazard management, or that you can't build in places that are risky, you can't build in the floodplain, we're going to monitor and enforce, and we won't give you funding if you do this, that, and the other. We also don't look at really, if they have a plan, how effective are those plans? We don't really monitor, and we have no means of enforcing it. Now, the Constitution grants states the right to manage land use, and in most states, they delegate that right to municipalities. And that has happened for so long, the municipalities assume the right and the control over land use is a God-given right for municipalities, and they will fight tooth and nail, and they will never give it up once they have gotten it. Very interestingly, now in California, there's been a push by some legislators to create funding, or to create a policy that does begin to have state influence on local land use planning. And they said, we're giving you all this aid to develop transit, but all the municipalities don't actually want more housing, and they certainly don't want more poor people housing, more affordable housing. And so they were seeing that they're investing in transit and there's not actually more housing created. There's a humongous deficit of affordable housing of all kinds in California. So the state started saying, what if we could prevent municipalities from preventing apartment buildings near transit? I mean, that's the language, right? You're not required to have it, you just can't prevent it. And that is a huge change in the policy discourse of land use planning. What about local governments? Do local government plans, right, have any amount of hazard mitigation? So the federal government, in order for municipalities to receive non-disaster FEMA assistance, are required to create a hazard mitigation plan. It's a plan where you, as a local government, review all the kinds of hazards you're vulnerable to and come up with some strategy for how you're going to be prepared and respond to this. Over 20,000 local governments have a hazard mitigation plan. That's huge. That's really huge, and that's really an important policy part of our realities. But there is no enforcement mechanism. There's nothing that says just because you have a hazard mitigation plan that you should pay attention to your hazard mitigation plan. You should align your land use and development plans so that they take heed of all those hazards that you've identified. All right. One more set of policies. Where do we get local government revenues from? You can see here that about a third comes from transfers. So federal government gives to states, states give to local government. And mostly federal government just gives to states. So really what local governments get is from state governments. So a third of this mainly is state funding for local governments. And then 30% nationwide comes from property taxes. And in some states, like the Northeast, that's going to be much higher, 75, 85% can be, or can be that high. So, and then, it's 70, 80% of your own source revenues, but it would be probably about 40, 50, 60% of some states can have that much from property taxes. Charges, user fees and charges, things like your water bills, your electricity bills, your solid waste bills, all of those things are starting to rise. And then sales taxes. All three of those categories, property taxes, user charges, sale taxes, they increase when you have more people living there. And if they're wealthier people, so much the better, because then you can squeeze more money out of their property taxes and their user fees. So these are growth-dependent sources of revenue. And what we have also seen is that the transfers from federal and state sources have declined over the years, except for school districts, especially where it comes down to urban services, transportation, water, environment. Those fees have actually gone down. And so the pressures on municipal governments to deliver anything really has to increase. They have to get that money from somewhere, right? The state's not going to give it to them. The feds aren't going to give it to them. So they're looking to squeeze as much money as they possibly can from their pieces of land that they manage and they have authority over. So again, to show this, the feds invest in infrastructure. We ask the local governments to plan, but we don't make them plan and we don't enforce those plans. Landowners resist those regulations. When you guys take your environmental law classes with Professor Dick Booth, who is in CIP, you will learn all sorts of takings and pushbacks from residents who don't want to be regulated. And the courts have oftentimes been favorable to them. So municipalities tend to be rather hesitant about putting down a lot of regulations. If there's a disaster, there is insurance that can restore insurance. You can have disaster assistance for municipalities. And heck, if you were too poor to buy insurance, well, the city probably doesn't want you living there anyway, because they'd rather have you replaced by somebody richer and they can spend less on you and squeeze more tax dollars out of you. And finally, there's tremendous fiscal pressure on municipalities to increase development revenues. And so it is of little surprise then that we have the land use schemes that we do in this country, where we see massive amounts of development on the coast in vulnerable areas, and that there's little interest in changing that. Now, this has been a dynamic that has governed this country for many, many decades, and it's worked sort of for some time. But with the increase in climate change impacts, what we have seen, almost all of these disasters you see on the screen are actually from meteorological events. They are not, there are earthquakes and volcanoes on there, but you'll see that in terms of their colors, the ratio, the amount that they have is pretty much static over time. What has really dramatically increased is the number of water hydrometeorological events, and that's related to climate change. So the more that we have this kind of impact, the more that costs are going to increase. We have improved our disaster management to the extent that we see fewer fatalities from disasters. But we continue to build more and more in vulnerable areas, which is why you see how even as fatalities in blue has declined, in green, the economic impacts has increased. And so we've known this for a long time. This is an article from the 90s saying that how do we know better and we continue to lose even more. So I want to talk about what this means for local governments and what we've seen them do with respect to adaptation for cities. For a long time, we didn't pay attention to this relationship between land use, fiscal policy, and climate change disaster impacts. Last summer, a report came out that for the first time using Zillow data, tabulated what would be the fiscal impact of one kind of hazard, sea level rise, to one part of the municipal budget, which is property taxes. And it found that so 2045 is within what? 30 years. So within the current mortgage cycle, properties being sold right now contribute about $1.5 billion in property taxes. And so for about 120 communities, there's not that many given how many municipalities we have, but for 120, that means 20% of their local tax base is at risk. And for 30 of those communities, 50% of their tax base is at risk. And that number begins to increase dramatically the farther out into the century that we go. Okay. We did this, I did this study with a student of mine for coastal Massachusetts using some more granular data. And we found that the impacts were about twice as significant as what they had projected for the state of Massachusetts. But what you'll see here is that those impacts are really unevenly distributed across the coastline. Right? Some places have a lot of impact, 10 to 25% in dark brown of their total municipal budget will be affected by 6 feet of sea level rise. But some of them in yellow, very little, even at 6 feet of sea level rise, it's like no big deal for them, fiscally speaking, right? So there are some clear winners and losers in terms of where people that are going to do well under climate change. So you might say, well, the people in dark brown, well, I don't know how they're going to fare out. But the people in yellow, it could be a climate boon for them. Don't go to the shoreline. Come to us. We're the next waterfront retreat. We're very resilient to all these disasters, right? They could do fairly well. But from a resilience, regional resilience standpoint, that's really problematic to think that way, even if it works out in the local logic for a municipality, because if the roads in one municipality aren't working and its workers can't get to work, it's not going to do the whole region any good, even if some municipalities are doing fairly well. You can also see that there's some disconnects. We separated out those municipalities into the ones that have really bad fiscal impacts, which tends to be the central municipalities around Boston, the ones that have medium level impacts, which tends to be some richer, usually wealthier residential seaside suburbs along the coast, and what we call dryland retreats, places that have higher elevation and they're going to do fairly well. And you can see that there's no logic to growth, right? So the population growth between 2000 and 2015, it's not that people have been moving to higher places. In fact, they've been moving, if anything, more to Metro Boston, which is actually more vulnerable to climate change impacts than elsewhere. You can also see that the places that are more impacted, so around central Boston, the land area tends to be quite small. Boston is a bit bigger, it's 20 square miles, but some of those municipalities are like 2 square miles. Whereas some of the larger suburbs, they tend to be larger spatially speaking. So you have more land to retreat to. But if you're a built out city, where are you gonna go? Where are you going to offset these inundated sites with? How are you going to get replacement revenues? So what have we been seeing on the ground? If you're a municipality that is in a well-located place that's growing, New York, Boston, San Francisco, maybe you can afford it and you have the political clout to get a lot of investment. So here you have the Rotterdam dikes that everybody wants a model. Well, the Dutch did it, so we can all do it, right? So here they recently had UMass Boston evaluate, can we build a giant harbor barrier for Boston? Connect these harbor islands and build a giant wall that opens and closes and lets support boats in, that kind of thing. And the people calculated, said, well, it's about $10 billion, $10 billion. And we got the big dig, which was really just $14 billion to build a giant hole in the ground. So maybe we could land another $10 billion to build some seawall. But actually it wouldn't be very cost effective, because by the time sea level rise gets to a certain amount, you'd be opening and shutting these things so often that you basically would have to keep them closed. These are not like doors. They're not meant to be opened and closed very often. Right? So they advocated for site-specific solutions. But I don't know that people have given up on that idea, maybe just for now. In New York, Manhattan, this is the big U, part of the post-Sandy recovery. There was a $1 billion competition for resiliency redesigns for Manhattan. And this was one of the winning proposals, to create a mega green infrastructure, green-gray infrastructure that would protect Wall Street and go all the way from the lower west side all the way down around Wall Street and up through the lower east side. And lo and behold, for one, they discovered that the lower east side, which is not, a little bit off what you can see here, it wasn't going to be feasible to build a park that could be floodable. They're going to have to actually raise that entire area and have it be like a seawall type of infrastructure. And the community there was extremely distraught and disappointed after having engaged in this process for a decade and not see that kind of proposal that they saw coming forward. They also discovered that in Wall Street, that what would really help, you can't have enough green infrastructure. What they really need is a giant seawall of the kind that would be 500 feet into the East River, fill the East River for that much, build it up as a berm, and maybe develop on it. How are you going to pay for this? Maybe you could build a giant seawall, then you would create new developable land. And we just had a planner from the city of New York for Manhattan's borough come and speak at CRP last Friday. And he said, people were talking about like an environmental impact review. We can't do an environmental impact review. Like, this is a do or die situation. It doesn't matter. We need this seawall. We have to have it. And you can't go through this kind of a long, drawn out political process where people are going to debate spawning grounds of this or that. We have to have this seawall for $5 billion. So this is the kind of debate moving forward, right? We're not talking about retreat by any means. And if you look in Boston, all these municipalities in Metro Boston, Cambridge, Boston, the other ones you see there, they've all done their vulnerability assessments, their hazard mitigation plans. And these are the new big ongoing redevelopment projects that are happening, that are either already in the ground, in the planning works, under construction, in proposal stages. And they are all located within 6 feet of sea level rise. If you look at South Florida, everybody says South Florida is doomed. It's apocalypse. It's going to be, goodbye Miami. They did a regional plan that accounted for sea level rise. You can see this diagram right here in their regional vision plan. Sea level is rising. But by 2060, we can accommodate 3 million more people in Southeast Florida using certain resiliency measures in order to protect and retreat. And a lot of this will be about more aid. They're advocating for more federal aid to fund this. New York doesn't have $5 billion out of its pocket if Mayor de Blasio runs, or if Kristen Gillibrand becomes president. Maybe they're going to shift from a border wall to a seawall. I don't know. So it's that kind of a debate. And then in terms of resiliency funding, what most places are talking about is, why don't we have better insurance? Why don't we stimulate private investment? How about we have resiliency fees and funds and bonds and diffs and bids? All of these things are about having more growth. You invest in a place, you capitalize on the increased revenue that it can give you over time to pay off your loans, to pay off the fees in order to fund resilience. These are not financing mechanisms about getting out of vulnerability areas. These are financing mechanisms that enable us to entrench development in places that are vulnerable. And that's the good story for places that can invest, that have the money and the political clout to get that level of investment. They're attractive to growth. People want to go there. What if you're in a place that nobody wants to go to and you're still facing this level of impact? Where are you going to get the money? You're probably not going to get the money. So there are places, this is an article from Troy, where somebody said, my drowning city is a harbinger of climate slums to come. So it's very possible that if you're not able to invest in resiliency measures, that people are going to not want to move there. Your properties are going to become depreciated in value. The depreciation in value is going to start triggering lower property tax revenues. And that may or may not be devastating for municipality, depending on how big it is, how much room it has for redevelopment elsewhere. Certainly for a lot of the smaller coastal municipalities, this is a real challenge. And based on the studies of existing places that that are strapped for money, what do? What do municipalities do when they don't have enough funding? The first thing they cut is road repair. They also cut a lot of services, snow removal, police, garbage pickup, elder services. They eventually will cut staff, but that is a highly unpopular measure. So the more that they are strapped for cash, the less that they can invest in basic services and maintenance and repairs, right? And if they're not able to do that, that can further catalyze and accelerate or exacerbate the kinds of natural vulnerabilities as floodwaters more frequently erode roads and other forms of infrastructure. At the federal level, we have seen a desire to reform the national flood insurance so that it reflects actual risks, right? And what this has done is to dramatically increase the cost to the homeowner. Some people were seeing their costs from a flood insurance premium of like $2,000 or sorry, $800 a year to thousands of dollars a year. The actuarial risk would actually be for this house, $25,000 because every 10 years we're going to replace your house. That's the actual insurance cost. How are you going to sell your house if now you tell the next homeowner, by the way, when you buy this house, you also have to pay $25,000 a year on flood insurance? So in places like Norfolk, Virginia, people are already beginning to have difficulty selling their homes, and that depreciates the value of your house and in time depreciates your property tax revenues. So who can afford to buy these homes? Very, very wealthy people. Very wealthy people who can elevate that home so that it no longer applies under the FEMA flood insurance requirements, and who can also afford to pay flood insurance. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we don't want poor people living on the coast being vulnerable. Maybe we want rich people who can pay their way out of a disaster. But that also means that the insurance premiums that we pay out through FEMA are also increasingly, are they subsidizing wealthier communities? Like, what is the logic? So finally, I want to just show an example of some of the work that I'm doing with students in Metro Boston, building on that study we did of coastal vulnerability. So you can see here, this is the harbor of Boston, and all of these, this is downtown Boston, this is Logan International Airport if you fly through there, and all of these green things are harbor islands. And all through here, these are all in gray words, all different municipalities. So we have been working, if you look at this little peninsula that juts out here, this is Hull, and then Cohasset and Hingham. So if you look at this map, these three communities here, Cohasset, Hingham, and Hull, are three different municipalities. And if the flood maps here in blue show basically either flood risk for FEMA flooding or sea level rise. And under 6 feet of sea level rise, Nantasket, or Hull, basically, this peninsula becomes a series of islands, just like the rest of the harbor islands. And it's one of the most densely settled parts of Boston, as you might see from the next one. But the next two municipalities are much more suburban communities. And they're actually, even though they're all like about 96% white, they're very white communities, Hull has an average average individual income of about $50,000. Hingham has an average individual income of about $100,000, and then Cohasset has an average individual income of $125,000. These are very wealthy wealthy places, but there is an income disparity between them. So here's Hull. You can see it's very dense along here, a lot of little walkable urban streets, tiny lots, this working class white collar community that has changed over time from a temporary beach summer house place to, as the housing market in Boston has heated up, where people live full time now, and a lot of professionals go there for their affordable housing. And it's, you can sell a place in Boston and buy a whole house here, right? And then you can see the surrounding places, you know, they're multi-million dollars of houses. I took my students on a drive when we went on a field trip a couple weeks ago, and they're like, we can live in their garage. I mean, these are very wealthy properties, right? And this is what it looks like in winter. And this is what it looks like when we were there. Can I click something here? I'll just show you. So we're standing in one of the skinny parts of Hull, and you can see that there is the ocean behind the people standing there. This is an empty lot here, and if I'm able to play it, you'll be able to see the ocean on the other side. You can see water on the other side. So this is a very thin site. And what this place has decided to want to do is, this is an actively bidded on lot, this 5-acre site that is receiving redevelopment proposals for how can we build this and generate more tax revenue, diversified revenue from commercial in different places. So effectively, right, we are trying to squeeze places like this. You would look at and say, well, why don't we just retreat? Why are these people continuing to engage in this kind of totally doesn't make sense logic? And as we've discussed here, is what you're seeing is they're responding exactly as you would expect them to respond. They should try to maximize all the development revenue they can to benefit their own residents. And as much as this community of Hull is protecting the surrounding communities behind it from sea level rise and coastal storms, those places don't want to pay for anything to do with that other municipality. It's not their responsibility. Do they want them to migrate there? Well, we talked to people there and said, they won't even engage in play dates. Those people from Hull, those working class, you know, blue collar, $50,000 a year places, we don't want to engage with them, right? So the kind of rivalries, we can talk a nice game about regional collaboration and we're all in this together, but when it comes down to it, each municipality is going to want resources for itself. And no matter what kind of planning process you engage in, very participatory, bottom up, you talk to your neighborhoods, you talk to your residents, they're going to want resources for them. Right? They want others to invest in them. And they want to continue to develop as they do and not necessarily have to change. So the reality is, I think, that we have been talking a very good game about various redesign, resiliency measures that are about architecture and landscape architecture to make it so that we can effectively live as we have before. And in some places, this might work and buy us some time. In the long run, it would be very difficult to escape escalating levels of sea level rise. So you've built your additional 3 million people into a place where sea level rise is now not 2 feet, but 6 feet moving forward in the next 20, 30 years. How are you going to resettle, rebuild, protect against that much flooding? And so what I would say are some of these questions that we have. What new forms of property regimes, what kinds of fiscal policies, human ecologies, urban ecologies, human settlement can we imagine? What is a Green New Deal equivalent for our adaptation scheme that tries to address some of these fundamental drivers of why we continue to build in places that we should not be building? How do we have decision-making processes that allow us to engage in this kind of deliberation, in this kind of evaluation? Something that we've seen with this workshop where I've been teaching with students on is that a lot of the software programs that we're using to do land use planning, to do real estate calculations, they don't allow us to do this kind of long-term dynamic evaluation of different possibilities, much less do it across jurisdictions. That kind of complexity is not possible. So if we can't even evaluate it, how are we going to actually discuss it and make relevant decisions about it? At what scale should we manage for land use and climate adaptation, these kinds of decisions? Should it continue to be a local decision? Should it be a regional discussion? Should it have a different kind of state and local relationship? Because we have historically at times had different relationships between feds, states, and local governments with respect to land use and infrastructure and funding requirements. And finally, what kinds of institutions and governance regimes could we have? Because the current institutions, whether that's FEMA or the kind of toothless regional land use management institutions that we don't really have the ability to plan for, much less in particular implement and enforce the kinds of decisions that we might need given climate change. And so all of this that I've been talking about has been for one hazard, sea level rise, one part of the budget, which is property taxes. But if you think of all the different hazards, inland storms, winter storms, heat waves, droughts, fires, and all the possible parts of the budget that could be affected, the ability of your people to move, the loss of income taxes, the ability of, you have to pay more for all sorts of expenses, the lost economic revenues if businesses are not able to perform on certain days. The budget implications are actually much larger than just the property taxes that I've discussed today. So I think that there is a looming real gap between the policies and the financial management structures we have in this country for this. And we have to be thinking on a much more systematic and large scale, visionary scale than what we have been doing today. And so I hope that all of you guys, I want to open this up for conversation in the next 25 minutes, I think we have. And to see what questions you have, but also to encourage you to really engage deeply with these issues in the course of your studies here.
Questions?
Hi. So has there been any examples in any other countries about like successful intervention programs or like just like differences in the way the government is structured that made for like successful incentive programs to disincentivize municipalities and like private actors in building and developing in vulnerable places?
Is this working? Yes, back on. I'm told that they can't both be on at the same time, so I have to turn this on. That's a really great question. And it's probably much more fruitful to research things that work than to research things that don't work. But that chart I showed you, where mortality declines but economic losses have increased, that chart actually applies for the entire world. So that dynamic we are seeing, regardless of the political regime, centralized, not centralized, democratic, not democratic, global south, global north, that dynamic remains true because most places tend to manage their land use in some similar respects. You can even think of like China, which seems totally different. The way that municipalities finance themselves in China is not through property taxes, but by leasing land in use rights. And the lease fees to developers is what finances local government. And so the same kind of demand to develop operates there, even though the tax base is so very different. People will point to the Netherlands and say, well, look at them. They're very successful. Their governance model is quite different, and they have a lot more centralized control over water and somewhat more centralized control over land use. And so they have, to some extent, been able to use those controls to resettle people and to change the kind of build a dike here, move people, room for the river type approaches that they have there. But they also have the challenge that they never had the kind of environmental laws that we do in this country that require environmental impact reviews that protect ecosystems. So for them, it's less of a problem, historically speaking, to put in those kinds of major infrastructure approaches because they don't have the kind of environmental protections that we do here. And even today, when people talk about, oh, the Dutch have living with water, room for the river, the kinds of approaches that they're putting in continue to be quite infrastructure based. And so it's a different question, but you could also look at the long historic wealth that they have had as a country because they were the wealthiest colony that enabled them to use some of that riches to build some of those infrastructure resources that they're most renowned for. Most places don't have that kind of funding. So I think the infrastructure approach, there are maybe other countries that deal with it better, but the land use question, I don't think is well done really in most places.
So I know that a lot of carbon dioxide is produced in cement production because of infrastructure or construction in general. So I was wondering, in building resilient communities, is there an effort to use different methods rather than using cement, because that would further climate change effects?
I think that to some extent the approach to the popularity right now of green infrastructure, I don't think that people are really proposing green infrastructure because of the lack of cement, but because it offers many other benefits. And certainly the more green that we can do, maybe that has more benefits. And now there's discussions of rammed earth and other forms of construction that perhaps offers benefits with that, with regard to that. But if you're talking about holding back the forces of the ocean in a storm surge, it's very few kinds of natural infrastructure that can withstand. I mean, nature would get destroyed in those kinds of storms. So the kinds of mechanical engineering solutions that you would have, I think there's room for innovation there, but I haven't seen very much that will move away from that.
To a certain extent, you seem to have put into contrast or contradistinction the preparation of the mitigation, I guess you could say, of these storms and environmental issues. But if you pair the two and put them together, is there a parallel kind of track that you can get rather than looking at one as being a barrier to the other? Because you've said environmental restrictions and so forth make it difficult to do that. But the environmental restrictions, in a certain sense, are there in order to curtail, well, like climate change and other things that are causing these matters. So it's like a, yeah.
That's a very good point. I don't say that because I'm bashing environmental regulations. I'm sharing what people's reactions to environmental impact regulations are, that they're trying to advance things and hoping that there's leeway on those regulations rather than taking the opposite approach, which might be, should we be ceding room for nature in order for both human and non-human society or ecosystems to thrive. And South Florida, I think, demonstrates this in very clear terms, because the South Florida plan, which I noted is going to put 3 million more people in South Florida. It also supports Everglades restoration. It also supports dunes and mangroves and those kinds of green infrastructure. And I would argue that a lot of that green infrastructure is good for humans and good on the margins for environmental systems. But 3 million more people in South Florida is going to require so much more groundwater extraction, wastewater loading, stormwater loading, the kind of impact that would have on the Everglades, which is 80% of the Everglades are under 3 feet of sea level rise. So the Everglades are going to be basically extinct with long-term sea level rise. And the conversation is, how do we use green infrastructure to protect human societies, and not how do we get out of the way and have the Everglades have somewhere to migrate to, right? I mean, that's just such a totally out of the, it's not even worth talking about, because there's obviously so much money sunk in South Florida that we wouldn't have that conversation. So do we want to have it? Maybe we need to have more environmental push policies that would go hand in hand with a retreat-oriented approach.
So it's a very nice presentation, but I heard the same presentation when I was a graduate student in Berkeley in the 1960s from Ian McHarg. Now, before we get unduly depressed, is there somewhere in the country that's actually doing something right?
Probably more people should be listening to Ian McHarg. And Ian McHarg, who's a landscape architect, comes out of a tradition of Patrick Geddes, of Lewis Mumford, Ian McHarg, that talked about living with nature and understanding the landscape and governing yourselves accordingly so that humans recognize their integral relationship to nature, rather than this approach, which I think right now with green infrastructure is a very instrumental approach of saying, we just replace the gray with the green, but it's actually not about having a different kind of societal relationship with nature at all. So I think we need more of Ian McHarg. And I don't necessarily think that we need to have that this is new, but that possibly, maybe hopefully, if we want to have this big transformation that everyone's talking about around climate change, that we should be paying more attention to those kinds of issues. And does climate change provide the push, as Naomi Klein says, that finally gets everybody over some of those issues? Now, have any places done it right?
You got sand dunes on the beach in Seaside, Oregon, where they used to just have beach.
So I think on a smaller scale, we have seen those projects work. Even in Staten Island or other places in New York after Sandy, there were buyouts and there's talk of dune restoration. In Louisiana, we've seen the Ile de Jean Charles, which is one of the first communities to be wholesale relocated. These are incredibly costly. They are about, what was it, for the Jean Charles, Ile de Jean Charles, it was something like $800,000 per person. Unfortunately, because there were so few people in that community, it was possible under the Bureau of Land Management, because it's a native community, that they were able to fund that. And if we're talking about millions of people, it's a really different challenge. So I have not yet ever seen or heard of somebody relocating a tower or a dense development, only individual households in that case. There are some policies in the 90s. The idea of rolling easements became really popular. The rolling easements would say, as you tell homeowners, we've established a rolling easement in this coastal zone. And as the seas rise or as nature changes, if your house becomes now under or within the high tide margins of this zone, you recognize that you may no longer repair or restore or rebuild your house in the event of a disaster. And the property price reflects that to the next owner who buys his house with that in mind. And Texas actually adopted that policy some time ago under the Open Beaches Act, and then it was challenged in courts by very conservatively supported litigation where the woman had bought a house with that stipulation and still sued as a takings, and she was able to win that lawsuit. So there is, now the state has amended that regulation so that it is the commissioner of the Open Beaches Act who is able to decide whether or not they should make a determination, but it's entirely, what is it called, under his own or her own purview, how to use that.
Any more questions?
You mentioned that retreat is not really part of the national conversation. And I'm wondering maybe at what point do you think that is going to happen? Because I worked in Norfolk last summer, and they're going to have about 40 to 60% of their landmass area flood in the projected storm surge, but retreat is still not part of the conversation. So I'm wondering maybe if you have any insight on when that might happen, or if it's just really not an option ever.
In June, Columbia and other New York City universities are hosting a conference called At What Point Managed Retreat. So I encourage you to attend this conference where maybe they will answer just such a question. When I was starting on this, adaptation is a fairly new topic, but in the beginning, that re-RE word, retreat, redevelop, resettle, people would just put it in quotes as RE. You couldn't even finish the word because nobody wants to talk about it. So the fact that there is now some conversation is a step in that direction. But the reality, I think, will come in part, for my dissertation, I was researching all these different city regions in the US, and they were all starting these regional collaborations on climate change. And this was, to quote somebody who's very knowledgeable in this field, like the whole field thinks this is the best thing since sliced bread, that we're going regional up from local. This is going to solve it, right? And so my assessment of things like that was that we were talking a really good game, but it wasn't actually affecting how local governments were behaving, because they were doing the exact same thing they always did, with the presumption that at some future point, the feds, the state is going to bail them out, pay for infrastructure, give them disaster aid, or do something. It's not going to be my problem. So that was sort of my motivation with doing a fiscal analysis of what are the impacts, because when you bring it home to them in this way and say you cannot continue because you're going to go bankrupt, you're going to erode your finances, and nobody is going to come to the Calvary, are not going to come for your kind of a community. Maybe Manhattan, maybe Boston, maybe San Francisco, but not your type of community. Then it might have a different motivation for what do we do when there's not enough money to go around.
Other questions? Okay, let's thank the speaker again. And